Hey everyone, I am Steve from GamersNexus.net, and today we're reviewing the R9 Fury X, the new AMD card. They just launched the Fury non-X version, which is an air-cooled version of this card, and that's priced at about $560, and it's rumored to have spurred NVIDIA to drop the 980 Ti price by $20 to $630. I haven't seen that take hold yet in retail outlets, but it is supposed to be forthcoming. So for the Fury X, this is $650. It's a liquid-cooled Fiji card, so it uses the new Fiji architecture, and perhaps more importantly, it's got HBM memory, or rather redundant high bandwidth memory. So it uses HBM rather than GDDR5, and this is a big step in the new direction for GPUs. This is something that NVIDIA will be doing in the future, as well as it drastically improves the memory bandwidth available for the card to work with. So for this benchmark, we look at the frame rate performance as usual. We look at frame times and the average FPS, look at the thermals, and also at power in terms of watt draw. The power isn't looked into as in depth in this video as it is in the full review. So for full information on the power draw, the thermals, frame rate, all of that, hit the link in the description below for the Fiji architecture drill down and the Fury X review. But let's get started with a overview of the new Fiji architecture by AMD and see if this promised return to form is actually able to compete in today's modern market. It's been several years since AMD's released a new architecture. They've been on 28 nanometers since 2011, so this is potentially a big deal for them, and it's important to really address all the architectural and new memory bandwidth increases and all that sort of stuff in the depth that it deserves. So AMD's Fiji architecture is brand new for the Fury X. It's featured on the Fury also, and this is something that wasn't shown on the new 300 series video cards that we also reviewed. Those, in fact, were refreshes of the previous architecture. They were more similar to Tonga in many ways than Fiji. And they weren't true rebadges, but they were refreshes, and that was discussed in a previous video. Today, we're talking about Fiji. It's still 28 nanometers, and it's probably one of the last 28 nanometer chips that will be produced by AMD. AMD really can't go any bigger than they already have. The GPU die size is 596 millimeters squared, which is pretty darn big for a GPU. And to put that in perspective, NVIDIA's GM200 Maxwell chip is 601 millimeters squared, so there's really not a lot of room for growth here. And that limitation is imposed because of lithography issues, where the stepper scanner systems that are used to create and fabricate these dies, these silicon wafers and dies that are cut from them, are limited by the reticle. It's called the reticle limit. We won't see larger GPUs, if at all. We definitely won't see them until after we move to a smaller fab process. For Fiji, AMD is sticking with its GCN architecture, that's Graphics Core Next. It's been around for quite a while now, but they're using GCN 1.2 effectively. It's not really officially called that, but that's what it is. So Fiji has a new version of GCN, and there are a few improvements to GCN 1.2. Some of them come from the 300 series that we already talked about. Those are not on a new architecture, but they did make some improvements to GCN that were carried over here. And one of the main ones that you'll hear about is called Delta Color Compression. This is similar to what we talked about with Maxwell, where the GTX 980 introduced what NVIDIA calls third generation Delta Color Compression. AMD is doing something similar here. So the idea is that Delta Color Compression looks at the frames temporally, meaning over time. So you have frame N and frame N plus 1. And in this example on screen, frame N is the one you're seeing now, where you've got the grid car and you see all the colors just fine. Frame N plus 1 is the next one, because we're looking at it temporally, and you see all of the pink sort of pixels shaded in. This helps indicate where colors have changed. And what this is doing is telling the GPU, hey, these colors have only changed so much within the value. We can just take the delta of the change rather than fetching and redrawing based on an absolute value. So this process reduces the bandwidth consumption of the memory by about 40%. And the compression ratio here is about 8:1. So you can see that the tiles are compressed 8:1. Similar to the 300 series, Fiji improves the power efficiency of the Fury X card. So AMD has made great efforts to reduce the thermal and power envelope of their GPU. They've done this in a few ways for Fiji. The first main one is that APU technologies have been sort of lifted from APUs and imported into Fiji, more or less. So a couple of those would include dynamic voltage, which just means that the voltage modulates itself and regulates itself based upon load. That helps reduce thermals and it helps reduce power drawn. Another item moved from APUs to the GPU is the clock rate and its ability to sort of fluctuate dynamically as well. So it modulates the clock rate based upon load. But of course, the most immediate thing on everyone's mind is the CLC, the closed loop liquid cooler. This is manufactured by Cooler Master. I've got a great big whole page allocated to this thing in the article, so sort of click on that and just read that if you want to learn more. But the very short, most important items of the CLC are primarily that it helps in reducing thermals, which does a couple of things for power as well. The main item here is that sticking a CLC on the card will help reduce the power leakage from transistors. So as you heat components up on a device like a video card, as you heat up the transistors, there is a much greater chance of power leakage, meaning energy wasted. A couple other changes to the thermal envelope include the way that the shader array is handled. So the shader array will throttle when it's not in demand, and basically it's similar to the core clock. If the GPU detects that the shader units are unloaded, it will modulate how much power is assigned to those shader units and effectively gate the power provided to them. The shift to HBM further grants inherent power efficiency gains. It's definitely a noteworthy amount, but we'll have a full article and video on that in the future. That's too long to go into here, but HBM is the biggest architectural shift in GPU computing in quite some time. It is clear that this is the way the industry is going in the future, including NVIDIA. The question, of course, is, does this actually matter right now? Is it enough to achieve parity to match the performance of the 980 Ti, which is the most immediate competitor? Some other important architecture points before we dive into the frame rate performance here. Fiji's SIMD uses a 64 asset wide wavefront, which provides really a massive amount of lane potential for pixel and vertex shaders. So this is something where NVIDIA's warps, which is basically their name for a collection of threads, their warp is 32 assets wide right now. And this is part of why we see NVIDIA performing so well with gaming. They've really fine-tuned their architecture to optimize for gaming tasks. And AMD does really very impressively well with computes. Their compute is higher than the competing NVIDIA device, but they are a little more versatile, so they're not as specialized in gaming, and that's where we get this performance disparity where AMD will perform very well for OpenCL, where you've got complex data structures, and for NVIDIA, it's just really driven for gaming. So that's where we see that disparity. So more on all of this in the article. We talk about whether the Fiji is ROPS bound or triangle bound at different resolutions and things like that. HBM is a future topic. Let's dive straight into some of the benchmarks here. Next, we will talk about thermals and gaming performance. For discussion on the power draw, please see the article linked in the description below. So we have two different thermal charts. The thermal chart here shows average thermals, and you can see that the 980 Ti hybrid's at about 22.91 Celsius. The reference 980 Ti on Air from NVIDIA is 61 Celsius. And then Sapphire's fairly impressive cooler for the 300 series at 45, with the Fury X at 41. Not very impressive for the Fury X for thermals. It is much better than AMD has been in the past, so I will certainly grant them that. But for a liquid cooler, I think they could do a little bit better, even with the cooling of RAM and VRM. This next chart shows the thermals over time, and we only have the 980 Ti and the Fury X on here, so what you're looking at in the light blue is the R9 Fury X. You can see that it takes longer to sort of reach equilibrium, and when it does reach equilibrium, which is about 16 minutes or so into the chart here, you see that it's still warmer than the 980 Ti hybrid, but much cooler than the 980 Ti reference. So AMD is in a zone where we don't feel like we're thermally compromising our system
by sticking their GPU into it, whereas the 290X, which was running at 95 Celsius in many cases, began to be a bit of a concern because that warms up everything around it. So it is a step in the right direction, and that is a good thing. So this is where things get a little bit interesting. We did much more statistical analysis on our game benchmarks than we normally do, and that's all in the article if you're curious. For this video, we're only going to recap a few of the games. We'll very briefly recap The Witcher 3, Far Cry 4, Grid Autosport, and Shadow of Mordor, and if you want the rest, it's in the article. The Witcher 3 illustrates the Fury X's pretty confusing results very well. What you're looking at right now is the 4K result, and we're sitting at 56 for the average FPS with really a quite dismal 1% low and 0.1% low. And as we move down into lower resolutions, you will see that the performance gap, the delta between the 980 Ti and the Fury X, actually widens. So for the Fury X and CrossFire, the 4K performance is 56 FPS with pretty bad 1% low and 0.1%. The single Fury X is at 31 FPS average with the 980 Ti at 35 FPS average. So the 980 Ti is in the lead. We go down to 1440 and the gap widens. Now we go from 50 FPS on the Fury X to 58 on the 980 Ti. So our performance disparity has grown quite a bit. In fact, it has nearly doubled. It's gone from a 12% gap at 4K to a 24% gap at 1080p. So why is that happening? Well, this becomes a question of whether the Fury X is limited by its ROPs, its raster operation units, or if it is limited because of geometry. And from some analysis, it is my understanding that the Fury X is limited by its geometry performance. This is something we know. AMD is not particularly good at tessellation. They're not really particularly good at complex geometric elements in games. They're great at shaders, and that's sort of anything else they fall short. So that's what's happening here, and we're getting throttled by geometry performance. This is shown further in Grid Autosport. In Grid, you'll see that, interestingly, the performance actually becomes somewhat capped. So at 4K, the highest performing AMD device is the CrossFire Fury X configuration at 108 FPS. I should first note that Grid often exhibits some sort of abnormal frame rate performance versus other games. So this is one thing to note when you're looking at the chart. At 1440, notice how the whole chart has shifted in favor of NVIDIA, and where does the Fury X Crossfire sit? It sits at almost exactly the same FPS as in the 4K chart. So what's gone on here? Look at 1080. Now we're hitting CPU limitations or something else in the system because the 980 Ti, the Titan X, 980 Ti Hybrid, all of them are effectively the same FPS across the board. So we're hitting some other bottleneck in the system. Why then is the Fury X not also at this limitation at the 128 range? It's still sitting at 109. This is really quite confusing. We saw this in some other games as well. In the article, you'll see those, but at the end of the day, it's some sort of limitation in the pipeline that is not present on the NVIDIA cards. Far Cry 4 exhibits similar behavior to The Witcher 3, where we see the 980 Ti reference performing marginally behind the Fury X at 4K, and the SLI and Crossfire configurations sort of tying in their average performance. The 980 Ti SLI wins out barely in 1% low performance, but it's basically tied with the Fury X and Crossfire. When we drop to 1440, you see that the 980 Ti reference card jumps ahead by 15%. So again, we see a limitation in the pipeline, probably some sort of geometry or something like that. Now we're looking at Shadow of Mordor at 4K, and as with many of the other games in the charts, we see the 980 Ti Hybrid, which is a non-reference card, meaning it's more similar to what you would buy on the market from one of the manufacturers because it's overclocked to 1140 megahertz from the 1000 megahertz base, and that's basically every card on the market will be about that. So that's outperforming the Fury X by quite a bit, really. It's 50 versus 42 FPS. And moving to 1440 and 1080, you will once again see that the Fury X loses its gap in terms of delta between performance with the NVIDIA devices. GTA was interesting because we were able to exceed the 4 gigabyte HBM limitation on the Fury X, but check the article for information on that, further analysis. Let's very briefly look at overclocking. Here you're looking at the overclocking results table for the Fury X, and the next two will be the 980 Ti Hybrid and 980 Ti respectively. For the Fury X, we were only able to increase the clock rate by 60 megahertz to a maximum clock of 1110 megahertz. It's a pretty small jump, and the memory offset was 60 megahertz for a total of 560 megahertz, and this was validated with GPU-Z, with AIDA64, and with benchmarking. So it was applied to the cards. This is about a 5% overclock. The R9 300 series, we were able to get about an 8% overclock. Neither of these are particularly impressive. With the 980 Ti, we got in excess of a 20 to 30% overclock on average, and that's pretty massive. It has actually a very big impact on performance, as you'll see in these overclock benchmark charts. Meanwhile, the Fury X sees almost zero gain. It's really, in my opinion, not even worth overclocking. I don't know if AMD plans to release voltage tuning utilities for the Fury X, but as it stands now, there's really no point to overclocking the Fiji card. It just doesn't produce any noteworthy FPS gains.
So concluding for the Fury X, this has been a pretty difficult card to review because it's all new architecture. It's got HBM, which is brand new to any video card really that's in the consumer world. And AMD has made the right steps for improving their performance and achieving hopefully parity with NVIDIA. They've got a very powerful architecture that has huge compute performance. It's got a massive shader array, and those are good things for AMD. It's certainly much better in terms of power efficiency over the 290X. So the Fury X for power efficiency is only about 26 watts more than the 980 Ti, and yeah, it's still more, but at this point it's not forcing you to buy a higher wattage power supply. So that is a step in the right direction for sure. And the thermal performance could use tuning. I think that the tubing on the CLC is probably a bit of a concern for installation, but overall, thermal performance is greatly improved over the 290X as well and other previous flagships. So AMD is moving the right way. They hear the criticism and they're responding to it. Unfortunately, there are a few problems here in terms of performance for gamers. So the main one is AMD still suffers from poor frame times in a lot of games. Shadow of Mordor is a very good example. If you look at those charts, the 18 FPS 1% and 0.1% lows are pretty bad, and those are the numbers that impact fluidity of the experience. So when you're playing a game and you see a sudden spike, that is from the 1% and 0.1% metrics, where average FPS really is sort of irrelevant to that point because your gameplay has been interrupted. So AMD still falls short there. This could theoretically be resolved with drivers because Fiji and HBM are both very powerful items, and the 4 gigabyte limitation of memory isn't really prevalent in any games we've tested except for GTA 5 at maximum settings, and at that point it's producing unplayable frame rates anyway on all of the cards. AMD's driver support has been pretty disappointing. They've only released one WICL certified driver since December, and that was the one for the launch of this video card. So they've had a couple of betas, the GTA beta driver and Witcher 3 beta driver come to mind, but they're certainly behind on the driver and software optimization front, and that's a big problem for AMD, especially if they want to compete with NVIDIA, which is really pretty prolific in terms of game industry support and optimization. So AMD's struggling with the frame rate output on games where it should, in theory, from raw hardware, be able to produce a much better frame rate. And given their track record for drivers, I'm not sure whether we're going to see the steps taken that AMD needs to do. And until that point in time, the 980 Ti is just, it's a better buy right now in terms of performance, in terms of frame times, and if the rumored price drop is true, then that's certainly a factor as well. It overclocks much better, so you can get even more performance. And if the price or performance disparity closes between the 980 Ti and the Fury X, then it's possible that the Fury X will become a good buy because it is a promising card, but it needs to either be lower in price or higher in performance. So that's not where it is right now. I would be buying the 980 Ti at the $650 price point range. I haven't looked at the Fury Non-X, the air-cooled one that's much cheaper. I, from initial benchmarks, would believe that that's actually a pretty competitive card with the 980, not necessarily the 980 Ti. So that's where we stand on this. Check the article for the full analysis. It's 5,000 words or something. and has a lot of charts that you don't see here in this video. And I will see you all next time.